Hello YouTube and hello Stronger Now. So I watched your video on privacy, um, and I think that you are underestimating the issue. Um, on the one hand, I'm obviously not an alarmist. Here I am on YouTube, right? My face is here for the world to see. My name is not a secret. Where I live is not a secret, right? I'm not, you know, it's not something that I'm terribly worried about. But, or it's not something that I'm terribly worried about personally, as an individual. Um, but it is something that I worry about in terms of society, right? And that social dimension is what I don't think you've quite grasped, right? Um, and I want to point to two things that need to be conceived of or articulated, right? Two things that are essential to thinking through the social effects of sort of vast surveillance, which is what this is. I mean, we shouldn't be coy about it. So the two sides are, first of all, um, panopticism. Right? This is an idea first articulated by Jeremy Bentham, and then later expanded as sort of a metaphor by a pet philosopher of mine, Michel Foucault. Um, so, and it deals with the issue of surveillance. Now, what Jeremy Bentham conceived of, he actually designed a prison that he called the Panopticon, right? Um, and what the prison design was is that you have your inmates all arranged in a circle, and you have a prison guard in the center. Now, the trick is that the prison guard should be able to see all the prisoners, but not the other way around, right? Now, this was in the 19th century, so it wasn't, this is long before cameras or something. Um, the idea being is that the prison guard doesn't even have to be there, right? Um, the the idea is for the prisoners to quote unquote internalize the gaze of authority, right? To feel like they always could be being watched, right? Regardless of whether or not they are being watched. Um, this is a form of coercion. It's a form of the leveraging of power, right? It's a way to normalize behavior over sort of a vast scale. Um, and, you know, this is very common sense. I don't think it's paranoid to point out that surveillance has this effect. It does work this way. In fact, I used to work in a record store when those still existed, and um, we had a camera, but the camera wasn't a real camera. It was just the shell of a camera. It just looked like there was a camera there. There was no, there's no film, right? I don't even think there was a mechanism inside the thing. But the thing is that people would come into the store and people would behave as if they were being watched, regardless of the fact of whether or not they were being watched. They wouldn't shoplift, for instance, which is why it was there, right? Um, in fact, there were times where we caught shoplifters and they would deny it, and then we would say, well, let's look at the cameras, and they'd be like, oh, okay, you caught me, right? But there's no camera there. That's the point. So, when you hear about vast, surveillance, NSA, all that stuff, Prism and blah, 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 blah. When you hear about this stuff, the effect that it has on society is not so much about, oh, they are watching me, or oh, like, they will be reading my emails or something like that. That would be an obviously paranoid approach. And just counterfactual. It's the case that there's so much information being shared on the internet that it's just very doubtful that they would read something that I wrote, right? But the psychological effect, the large-scale psychological effect that's important is the realization that they could, if they wanted to, right? I have an iPhone, and the phone, I believe the iPhone 5, I could be wrong about this, but I believe the iPhone 5 phones home to Apple with GPS coordinates every so often, right? So I am being tracked. Like that information exists out there, right? If Facebook is open on your computer, it's been recently discovered, I believe, could be wrong about this, I believe that if Facebook is open in one tab in your browser, it will track everywhere else you go, right? So these companies are aggregating all this data, regardless of whether or not the NSA has their hands on it. But it's very easy for the NSA to get their hands on it, is what's important. Regardless of whether or not the NSA does have your information or does read your emails, they could be. Like, again, that's the point. The camera doesn't have to have film in it in order to modify people's behavior, in order to normalize people's behavior. That's the problem. In fact, there's a bar in New Orleans where I live called The Dungeon. And The Dungeon doesn't allow cameras, right? There's a big sign up saying no cameras allowed here, right? And you can see people behaving differently, right? You can see a different sort of ways of approaching one another and talking to each other and all of this. And it's not something sleazy, it doesn't produce like a sleazy, terrible environment. It's just that it produces a very different environment. If you walk into that place, and then if you walk into the bar next door, it's very noticeable how people behave differently when there's the potential that they're being watched versus no potential that they're being watched, right? So these kinds of surveillance programs are typically stated as being, we're looking out for, we're trying to catch child pornographers, we're trying to catch terrorists, we're trying to catch whoever else. But what's important is that it still has effects outside of that group of people that are being targeted. That's one thing that I think you're missing. The other thing that I think you're missing is much worse, much scarier to me, which is that how do social movements happen? How did gay marriage get legalized, for instance? Think about that history, right? The first person that I'm aware of in print in the modern Western world, post-Enlightenment, let's say, first person that I'm aware of to defend homosexuality in print was an anarchist by the name of Emma Goldman, who was sort of an intellectual hero of mine. In like 1900, like this was before women had the vote, right? It's a long time ago, and it was a crazy thing to say. Gay people should be able to marry, right? Gay people are not disgusting, deviants. So you see the offhand defense of gay marriage, but it was an anarchist who said it, right? Somebody who's way on the fringe of discourse. So how does that position turn into a moderate position? Well, in the 60s and 70s, and probably much before that as well, you had sort of secret places that were sort of known to gay people, right, where they could go and do their thing and whatever. But they had to be secret, right? You can't have, you could lose your job, you could lose your career, you could be ostracized from your community, you could lose a lot if it came out that you were a gay person in that time period. In order for gay people to be gay, to act as gay, if you like. Um, uh, they needed they needed a space of privacy, right? And that space or that zone of privacy eventually grew over time. You begin to see eventually you have these communities of gay people that begin to sort of crop together. Think of the New York City club scene in the 1980s as one of the places where being gay became most acceptable or most commonplace fairly early on. Um, but there was still this dimension of secrecy that was usually needed, right? Particularly if you weren't living in a major city. Um, so it's this ability for these people to come together and for this movement to sort of accrete over time in secret that allowed for something like the coming out movement to happen, right? The only way the coming out movement makes sense is if there were lots of gay people who were living gay lives, if that makes sense, in secret. Like, then the coming out movement can happen, and then you can have a real political challenge. You can say, the Defense of Marriage Act is some terrible thing, right? That becomes a position that goes from an anarchist position in 1900 to a moderate position in the 21st century. But that move, right, that 100-year shift required 100 years of secrecy, right, and privacy in order to function. You could say the same thing about atheism, right, in a very different way, but you could, the history is obviously very different. But now atheism is starting to become something that's socially acceptable. It wasn't 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And there are reasons for that. But the history is kind of similar. There are plenty of other examples as well. Think about Soviet dissidents, right? Like the collapse of the Soviet Union and subverting Stalinism or whatever you like. Pick a social movement, right? Pick a social movement that you can identify as something positive that happened. And what you will find very quickly is that that thing couldn't have happened if it weren't for secrecy and the capacity for privacy. Now, that being the case, we have to talk about what kind of world you want to live in, right? I want to live in a world where, so, my grandmother was a little racist, right? My parents are very old. They were born in the 40s. I'm only 27, but my parents were born in the 40s. My grandmother was born in 1914, right? My grandmother was a little racist. Almost not unexpected for somebody born that long ago. She didn't mean to be. She wasn't a cruel person. She wasn't a mean person. She didn't have anything against anybody. But just how she spoke about issues was very antiquated. How she thought about issues was very antiquated, in a way that I would call racist. Now, I look back at my grandmother and say, wow, she was kind of racist. Like, ooh, I have that kind of, I don't, I have a slight tinge of disgust at my grandmother's feelings on the issue of race. Now, I want to live in a world where my grandkids feel the same way about my opinions, right? I don't know what opinions of mine they might feel that way about, right? But I have to take for granted that norms, or I want to live in a world where norms progress and develop and are rearticulated, and I want my positions to look antiquated, and I want my positions to look, I want my grandkids to be so much more receptive and open to others than I could ever be, right? Than I can be in this world. That's the world that I want them to live in. Now, I don't think that that's possible given vast surveillance and given the potential for vast surveillance, right? Not even just the fact of surveillance, but the potential of surveillance, I think, makes that, if not impossible, much, much, much more difficult. So you can see that when we talk about something like moral progress, widespread surveillance, or the potential for widespread surveillance, regardless of whether or not they're looking at they are looking at my communications. The fact that they could be looking at my communications means that that potential surveillance is a way of arresting history, right? It's a way of arresting progress in a moral sense. Now, again, I'm not an alarmist. I don't mean to say that, oh, these terrible companies and blah blah blah. We need to. I don't know what alarmists say. But I don't think that we should be blasé about the issue. I think that we should be very, very anxious about it. I think that we should be very, very, very uncomfortable about it. And the reason is not so much because of my privacy as an individual, but it's because of the domain of privacy shrinking has very frightening social ramifications beyond the individual. And that's what I object to when I think of something like PRISM. That's what I'm uncomfortable with. And I don't see how you can be, oh, it's no big deal, right? It clearly is a big deal. Have a good day.